Mr. Bradley has moved private member's motion number 54. All those in favour of the motion will please rise and remain standing until recognized by the clerk.
Mr. Bradley. Mr. Curling. Mrs. Cunningham. Mr. Sterling. Mr. McLean. Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Jackson. Mr. Tilson. Mrs. Whitmer. Ms. Poole. Mr. Beer. Mr. Offer. Mr. Callahan. Mr. Dagler. Mrs. Fawcett. Mr. Grommet. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Johnson Don Mills. Mr. Brown. Mr. McClellan. Mr. Micklash. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Crozier. Mr. Morrow. Ms. Murdoch-Sudbury. Mr. O'Connor. Mr. Perruzza. Mr. Cormos. Mr. Frankfurt. Mr. Jameson. Mr. Hayes. Mr. Malkowski. Mrs. McKinnon. Mr. Sutherland. Mrs. Carter. Mr. Hanson.
All those opposed to Mr. Bradley's motion will please rise and be recognized by the clerk.
Mr. Wilson, Kingston and the Islands. Mr. Wood. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Bisson. Mr. Mills. Ms. Gigantes. Mr. Martin. Mr. Hope. Mr. Lassard. Mr. Fletcher. Mrs. Matheson. Mr. Murdoch Gray Owen Sound. Mr. Hodgson.
The ayes are 36, the nays 13.
The ayes 36, the nays being 13, I declare this motion carried. We will now deal with ballot item number 76, standing in the name of Mr. Cooper. Is it the pleasure of the House that Mr. Cooper's motion carried? Carried. All private members' business. Having been completed, I will now leave the chair and we will resume at 1:30. Order.
This is the Ontario Parliament Television Network.
Statements by members, and the Honourable Member for Mississauga North.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the leader of the third party asked a question about tax reduction and the tax legacy of the NDP government and indeed the former Liberal government. I thought that it might be a good idea to look even further back at the legacy left to us by the government Mike Harris was part of. I went back to the Progressive Conservative budgets for 1981, 82, 83 and 84. And guess what? I found 24 tax and fee increases, including expanding the provincial sales tax to trees, smoke alarms, household pets, and 19 other things. Interestingly enough, for the same Conservative years, there are only 2 tax decreases or tax reductions in the current lingo of the leader of the third party. Let's count the tax reductions during the Liberal years. From 1985 to 1990, the Liberal government reduced taxes 26 times. Now Mike Harris thinks tax reductions are a good thing. But let's go back to those Conservative tax increases. Members of the Legislature must vote to approve the budget and the tax and fee increases included in it. I thought it would be interesting to look up who voted in favor of those budgets of 81, 82, 83, and 84. In 1981, with the Progressive Conservatives voting in favor of the tax increases, was a person by the name of Harris. As well in 82 and 83 and 84. There he is again, a person by the last name of Harris.
John Harris.
Mr. Speaker, I thought the leader of the third party will want to track this other Harris, this imposter, down. After all, this other Harris didn't miss a chance to vote for higher taxes and fees for Ontarians. Surely the leader of the third party and this Harris character can't be one and the same person, or can they?
All right.
The Honourable Member for Burlington South.
Mr. Speaker, on January 31st, Joseph Brant Memorial Hospital in Burlington gave 1 week's notice to 120 families in active treatment and 90 families on a waiting list that it was terminating their speech-language pathology services for preschool children. These families were told their main alternative was to continue with the same therapist, but at a private rate of $80 per hour, quite unaffordable for most families. On May 2nd, I asked the Health Minister to undertake a review. Still no action. On September 13th, I asked the Social Service Minister to confirm which ministry assumes lead responsibility for these children. Still no action. Yesterday at Queen's Park, the Parents Advocating for Language and Speech, PALS, a group concerned with the erosion of speech-language services, brought a petition with more than 2,000 signatures calling on Ruth Greer to maintain accessibility to these services without paying user fees. When the Education Minister is funding second and third language programs at a cost of millions of tax dollars, parents ask why another minister would sit by idly while preschool children cannot access this vital health service to learn their first language because their parents are forced to pay user fees. Today I call again on Ruth Greer to make good on her May 2nd promise to investigate and restore this essential children's health service. She will know that 1 in 10 children experience some form of language difficulty. Speech therapy should not be delayed since it is most effective with early identification and early intervention. Without the early investment in our children, the cost to our society will be much greater in the future. Thank you.
The honourable member for Lincoln.
Mr. Speaker, let's talk about toxic waste. It's been a nightmare for the people of West Lincoln since 1985. It's been a decade since Ontario Waste Management Corporation chose West Lincoln as a site for its proposed toxic waste treatment facility. 2 weeks ago, the Consolidated Hearing Board rejected OWMC's proposal, and the thousands of people who opposed OWMC's toxic monster thought the battle was finally over. Mr. Speaker, the battle just began. Rumor has it that the OWMC will appeal the board's decision. If this happens, the Ontario Cabinet will have the final say on OWMC's proposal. Mr. Speaker, through you, I call on the Cabinet members to outright reject the appeal by the OWMC. Why? Because the people of West Lincoln do not want a toxic waste treatment plant in their backyard. They believe it is not needed. They believe that Ontario can best deal with its toxic waste problem by forcing industry to reduce toxic waste through recycling and by embracing new Canadian technology. That would allow industry to treat toxic waste on site. Mr. Speaker, Cabinet must put an end to West Lincoln's suffering once and for all. First, by rejecting any appeal by OWMC, and second, by forcing OWMC to give up its option on the land that was to be used for its proposal facility. They must listen to the people of West Lincoln. Mr. Speaker, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of killing OWMC proposal. Read my lips, Mr. Speaker. No new toxic waste plants in Lincoln.
The honourable member for St. George, St. David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we want to salute the advisors to Mike Harris who are trying to help turn him into Newt Gingrich, the Governor of Ontario, the 51st state in the Union. We see on the one hand Tom Long, one-time party president and leadership contender, who reputedly was the advisor who got Frank Miller to say on that ill-fated day, "I am the Ronald Reagan of Ontario." Tom Long, the former Mulrooney aide, is a great admirer of the policies of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. In fact, when Long was running the show at the Conservative Campus Association, he had a jar of jelly beans to munch on, just like Mr. Reagan. We also see the new Tory advisor, Mike Murphy, the Republican dirty tricks consultant, the master of negative advertising, who almost took Ollie North, the convicted liar and thief, to the U.S. Senate. These two had a plan: turn a down-home golf pro and teacher into the consummate actor, able to shift shapes, images, and convictions at a whim, depending on the circumstances and the audience he's talking to. He has reversed his position on user fees, once for him, now running radio ads against them, Mr. Speaker. In the last Conservative government, Mike Harris never found a tax increase he couldn't vote for. Now he says he's against all the taxes he voted for. And so, Mr. Speaker, Mike Harris has gone from being just another Conservative to being the tax fighter, to Mike the Knife, to the Bleeder, a sensitive New Age guy for the 90s. Sort of a Dr. Spock with feelings, a Data with emotions. Well, Mr. Speaker, in the next election, I expect the voters to beam him down. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for London North.
London teachers have given de-streaming a failing grade, stating it frustrates students, lowers self-esteem, and pushes more youths through the cracks of the education system. The Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation conducted a province-wide survey which illustrates that 80% of its teachers do not support the de-streaming process. The teachers were asked a number of questions, and the results were included in a report that concluded there have not been enough support services. De-streaming has reduced the opportunity to help individual students. It has reduced the ability to challenge stronger students. Student self-esteem hasn't improved and frustration has increased. Classroom management is more difficult. According to Bill Brooks, president of the London branch of the Teachers Union, the better students aren't challenged, the weaker students don't get the help they need, and in trying to please everyone, few are pleased. Minister, I believe that all students, no matter what level of learning they are at, deserve to be challenged in the classroom. We support excellence in education for our young people, not mediocrity. In my role as critic for education and training, I have been discussing this issue with students and teachers from across the province for over a year. Both criticize the lack of opportunities for students with learning difficulties, students with literacy challenges, and students with special program needs. What we should be focusing on, Mr. Minister, are programs including technical and cooperative that lead to jobs for students. Your common curriculum document and your de-streaming policy do not support excellent job training for students and do not support excellence for entrance into our colleges and universities either. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kitchener-Wilmot.
Thank you, Speaker. I rise today to pay tribute to Dominic Cadillo, who retired as the mayor of the city of Kitchener. Dom Cadillo served 32 years in municipal government, and throughout those 32 years he maintained this basic philosophy: how can I help this city? His focus was on quality of life and how can I help make this city truly user-friendly. Dom was totally committed to the community and to serving the people of Kitchener. I would like to mention a few things that have taken place during Dom's tenure at the municipal level. Improved recreational facilities, relocation and construction of a new city hall, additional parkland in the Chickpea area, funding for industrial lands, efforts to assist the Working Centre of Kitchener, and expansion of the Kitchener Memorial Auditorium. Speaker, Dom Cadillo entered municipal politics because he likes people. He is truly a people person. He believed in putting people first, their needs, concerns, and basically just how they were doing was very important to Dom Cadillo. If Dom said he would do this or that or talk to a certain person, he did what he said he would. He was reliable and consistent. It may have taken a couple of months, but he followed through on his commitments. To most people in the city of Kitchener and to visitors to the city, Dom was also known by another feature. Most who met Dom received either a city pin or pen, and sometimes both. To Dom, I would like to say that on behalf of the city of Kitchener, we wish you well on retirement. We thank you for your 32 years of commitment to the city of Kitchener. And henceforth, in Kitchener, BC will be before Cardillo, and AD will be after Dom. To Mayor Christie, I say congratulations, and I wish you well, and look forward to opportunities where you can work together for the city of Kitchener. To Gary Ledston, Carl Zaire, and Will Ferguson, who all serve the community well, I wish them well also.
The honourable member for Mississauga West.
Mr. Speaker, on what could be the last sitting day of this government in the legislature, I have here in my hand from the home city in Mississauga the top 10 list of NDP government firsts. Number 10, the first cabinet minister to appear as a sunshine boy, Peter Cormos, no doubt ranks as one of the most talked about, if not one of the best looking sunshine boys ever. Number 9, the first cabinet downsizing to result in a larger cabinet. They went from a cabinet of 25 to a cabinet of 27 ministers, supported by 31 parliamentary assistants, an amazing feat of streamlining. Number 8, a first campaign manager to be appointed secretary to cabinet. Number 7, the first time the auditor refused to sign off the government's books and the first government to keep 2 sets. Number 6, the first casualty of the information highway. John Piper caught leaking information to spear a member of the public. Number 5, the first investment in Peruvian utility by Ontario Hydro. But don't worry, folks, this will not be the last foreign investment Hydro makes if Chairman Mo of the Jungle has his way. Number 4, first $500,000 sabbatical for a political backroomer, Robin Sears, the most expensive exile since King Farouk. Number 3, the first minister to resign twice. Number 2, the first minister to resign twice, to refuse to resign twice, but finally relent and quit the cabinet. And my personal favorite, number 1, the first minister to take a lie detector test to prove that indeed she did lie.
The honourable member for Victoria, Halliburton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. For those who may not be aware, there is a smaller version of the IWA landfill site selection process going on in Victoria County. The process, which began in 1989, is not expected, in the most optimistic view, to be functional landfill for another 3 to 4 years. As it currently stands, residents around 5 shortlisted sites have had to put their lives on hold while this bureaucratic nightmare unfolds around them. They can't sell their properties. Potential new residents are turning away and looking elsewhere. Designating possible sites and then effectively freezing development around them for nearly a decade is unconscionable. It's unfair, and it's simply a way for the provincial government to throw a political hot potato into the hands of municipal politicians. What you've effectively done is created a never-ending make work project for consultants. By setting rigid, non-negotiable guidelines that apply no matter where you live in this province, you have eliminated common sense proposals from people who know what will work best in their communities. The flexibility to respond to local circumstances is absent from the whole process. High tipping fees are forcing millions of tons of Ontario garbage to the United States. This government is still determined to bury waste in agricultural land, the very land that sustains crops and farm animals to feed the people of this province. My message to the provincial government is this: the field of knowledge about waste management has surpassed your ideological crusade to simply bury things out of sight and out of mind. It's time to open up the process. Let the people see all the facts, not just the ones that support your outdated mode of thinking. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Guelph.
Thank you, Speaker. The Onward Willow Better Beginnings, Better Futures project continues to have very positive outcomes in the Willow Road neighbourhood, which was labelled in 1991 as Guelph's largest problem. The police have reported a dramatic reduction in vandalism and an increase in community involvement. In fact, Paul Morant, the staff sergeant from Guelph Police, said, "From my observation, Onward Willow has had a very positive input in that particular area. In the way police-related calls was a very busy area, and those calls have dropped dramatically. From my observations, Onward Willow has allowed the people living there to share and build in their future rather than just being occupants." The Wellington Guelph Housing Authority reports a dramatic increase in housing residents taking a more active role in community building, cooperation with the Housing Authority on the Tenant Advisory Committee, and there has also been a reduction in complaints of vandalism. The project has assisted a number of young offenders placed by the John Howard Society to return to school and to participate in community activities. Keeping one adolescent of a young offender out of a facility can save taxpayers over $100,000 per year. The principal of the primary school in the neighborhood reports that fewer children are going to school hungry. This has come about because families have access to bread and other food staples donated by neighborhood stores from their unsold stock. The community mental health clinic reports that the support provided to adolescent women who have been abused is resulting in many of the women seeking professional help and making positive changes in their lifestyles. These various outcomes are cost-effective, not only in dollars, but lead to better parenting and adjusted children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I invite all members to join me in showing appreciation to the pages who have served this chamber and the members so exceedingly well during the past several weeks. Will the members please show their appreciation to the pages? Statements by ministers. It is now time for the Minister of Citizenship.
Consent to mark the International Human Rights Day.
Do we have unanimous consent? Agreed? Agreed. Minister of Citizenship.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, colleagues. It gives me great pleasure to rise today in honor of International Human Rights Day, which will be celebrated on December the 10th. Nearly half a century ago, the members of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The United Nations has just been formed. A long and agonizing world war had finally drawn to a close. The world for many was again a place of hope. And the members of the United Nations moved, in their wisdom, to construct a fundamental pillar of civilized society, a Declaration of Human Rights. Mr. Speaker, that was some 46 years ago, in 1948. To this day, it is a document that should inspire and challenge us all. The Declaration recognizes the inherent dignity and the equal rights of all members of the human family. It notes that the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief, and freedom from fear and want, has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of a common people. And it proceeds to proclaim fundamental human rights that we all hold close to our heart. It is a substantial document, of course, one that we should reread regularly. It stands as a measure of our successes and our future challenges in ensuring the dignity and equality of all members of the human family. Mr. Speaker, the world remains a very troubled place. The magnitude of difficulties facing some people of the world should make us feel thankful for our relative security and prosperity in this province. But we can never afford to lapse into complacency when it comes to protecting the freedoms, rights, and opportunities of all women, men, and children. Here in Ontario, we still have a way to go to building a society free of barriers for all people in this province. Examples of acts of hate activities still exist in Ontario, Mr. Speaker. In fact, this week we saw that 3 businesses in North York were defaced simply because the owners of those particular businesses were members of a group, of the Jewish family. But we also have seen in my own riding, Mr. Speaker, some acts of hate as well. Hate against teachers who work in our school system, who are trying to provide education to all our young people. And at Humberside, we all are very upset about this particular type of occurrence. That is why this government is working with the people of this province to identify and dismantle barriers to our full social and economic development as individuals and as a society. The Government of Ontario is advancing its equity agenda on a number of fronts. And I'd like to share, Mr. Speaker, a brief overview of some of these initiatives. In the human rights area, we are taking active steps to protect and promote human rights in the province of Ontario. We recognize that the protection of human rights requires effective and efficient administrative operations, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission has taken a series of steps to improve such operations. As a result of a new case management strategy, the number of cases pending investigation was reduced from 924 cases, which was 45% of the caseload in March of this year, to only 352 cases, which is 15% of the caseload in September. As of October 31st, 1994, just 208 cases, the lowest number in 5 years, have been on file with the Commission for more than 3 years. By the way of comparison, at the same time last year, the Commission had 332 cases over 3 years old. The number of cases formally closed by the Commission between April and October of this year increased by 85% over formal closings in the same period in 1993. The Employment Equity Act, which took effect in September the 1st of this year, will help ensure that workplaces in Ontario provide equitable recruitment, treatment, training, and promotion to all employees. It specifically calls for employers to identify and remove barriers to employment for members of 4 designated groups, namely Aboriginal people, people with disabilities, members of racial minorities, and women. The Employment Equity Commission, headed by Juanita Westmoreland-Traore, is providing employers, unions, and employees with the information and support they need to make employment equity integral in the way they do business. The Advocacy Act, which will undoubtedly stand as one of Ontario's most important initiatives undertaken for vulnerable adults. The Act is designed to build bridges to independence for vulnerable adults who have difficulty expressing or acting on their wishes, and to help them assert their rights and autonomy, and to participate in making decisions about their lives. Along with the Substitute Decisions and the Consent to Treatments Act, the Advocacy Act is rooted in the idea that personal autonomy, the freedom to make choices and decisions, is a fundamental human right. This government has undertaken a number of initiatives to ensure the protection of human rights and equitable treatment for persons with disabilities. And allow me to provide some examples of how we are working towards a barrier-free society. In 1994-95, the Ministry of Education and Training has provided more than $11 million to help colleges and universities provide services to persons with disabilities. Under the Jobs Ontario Capital Program, this government has provided $10 million to help post-secondary institutions improve access and services for persons with disabilities. Under initiatives scheduled by the Ministry of Transportation, 13 GO transit stations are to be fully accessible by next spring. As well, new and key existing subway stations in Metro Toronto will be made fully accessible. Persons with disabilities will enjoy improved access to 15 provincial parks, thanks to $1 million in funding provided this year by the Ministry of Natural Resources. The Ministry of Municipal Affairs has supported the development of an accessible waterfront trail stretching from Trent River to Burlington Bay. Some 275 kilometers long, the trail is to open to the public next spring. The Ontario government has spent $38 million in the past 5 years to improve access to its buildings and facilities. Since 1990, more than 650 community groups have received a total of $18.6 million from the Ministry of Citizenship's Access Fund to make their facilities more accessible to persons with disabilities and senior citizens. As well, the Ministry of Citizenship has engaged in systemic and strategic cross-ministry initiatives to improve access for people with learning disabilities. We also develop an implementation plan with the Ministries of Education and Training and of Community and Social Services in response to the report on the status of oral interpreting services in Ontario. And finally, Mr. Speaker, a private member's bill introduced by my colleague Gary Malkowski has been debated this week in Standing Committee on Justice. And this bill is to help improve the equitable treatment for persons with disabilities. Bill 168 has provided opportunities for all of us to have vital discussion, dialogue, and debate, and will continue to have that dialogue and debate, I understand, Mr. Speaker, and how Ontario should move toward becoming a truly barrier-free society. We are fulfilling our commitment to combat racism and ensure that all Ontarians have equitable opportunities to contribute to our social and economic strength. The Ontario Anti-Racism Secretariat in the Ministry of Citizenship is leading the government's anti-racism agenda through its work in community coalition building and economic development, public education, and support for other ministries' activities. The Cabinet Roundtable on Anti-Racism is another example of the government's commitment to community dialogue in combating racism. The Roundtable, which brings together cabinet ministers and members of racial minority communities to share information and to work together to address obstacles, held its fourth meeting on November the 28th. A variety of important initiatives and issues were discussed at the Roundtable, including a range of government-wide, non-legislative, anti-hate initiatives. And Mr. Speaker, if I might add, I think that that is an extremely important and vital dialogue that we are having in our communities at this particular time. Our Access to Professions and Trades Unit is working in partnership with community groups, professional bodies, and other ministries to accelerate the processes by which newcomers earn accreditation to practice their trades and professions in Ontario. Mr. Speaker, the examples I've just provided show that this government is taking active steps to identify and eliminate barriers to the full participation of all Ontarians in our cultural, social, and economic systems. We are working on many fronts to ensure the inherent dignity and the equal rights of all members of the human family. We must always remember that our ability to respect one another is one of the most telling marks of our decency and our humanity. And we should join hands in a range of vigorous and active steps to create a barrier-free society for all Ontarians. Mr. Speaker, I am confident that all members of the House will join me in a salute to all the people of Ontario on December 10th, International Human Rights Day. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Scarborough North.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I, too, join with the Minister in recognizing the International Human Rights Day, which, as was stated, marked the 46th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Yes, 46 years have passed, Mr. Speaker, since the United Nations proclaimed December 10th as the International Human Rights Day. And the week of December the 5th to the 11th as the week when we should all reflect on what we are doing individually and collectively to ensure that human rights are enjoyed by all people, either in Ontario or anywhere else in the world. International human rights makes us automatically, Mr. Speaker, think of somewhere outside of the borders of Ontario, outside the borders of Canada, not here at home, as soon as we hear about human rights abuses. We live on a continent, Mr. Speaker, that accepts more diverse immigrants than anywhere else in the world. People come here with different ethnic, racial, and religious compositions we are constantly redefining who we are collectively as Canadians. We are a nation made up of people from all continents that have joined the native people who were here our original inhabitants. The native people of Ontario and of Canada, we know, Mr. Speaker, deserve the respect of all people in recognizing their culture. But what has happened, Mr. Speaker, is that we select what we want to see and we select what we want to hear, just to satisfy our conscience in a way that we're doing enough for human rights. But unfortunately, what we're also seeing around the world and at home are new terms of racism reinforcing the kind of status quo of superiority of one culture, race, or religion over another. We hear phrases, of course, like ethnic cleansing and phrases like those that tells us that one race is superior over the other. In Ontario, we may not see the degree of human rights violation that are suffered in some other parts of the world. And for this we should be grateful. But we are far from resting on our laurels, as much more work needs to be accomplished, as the Minister stated. Discrimination exists in Ontario. It exists in the case of the backlog of the Ontario Human Rights Commission is evidence of this. We must also fight against systemic discrimination that exists, and in working it, examining the institution in which we live to see now how we can make the society we live in more tolerable, accepting, and open to all. In recognizing Human Rights Day, it is important to remember that achieving human rights is a process that we must all be committed to, and that human rights not only include racial lines, but also the collective rights of the disabled. We must also recognize that for many in the disabled community, their rights here in Ontario are breached every day when fair accommodation to their needs are ignored. 4 to 5 years ago, of course, the United Nations saw the need to pass a declaration of human rights for countries to use a benchmark. And some have done better than others, but I hope we will all reflect on what we can do to help human rights to be enjoyed by all. In my riding, Mr. Speaker, we have seen a transformation of different ethnic groups. As a matter of fact, almost 40% are from the East Asian countries. And therefore, we have to re-examine ourselves, as I stated earlier on, of who we are as Scobberites, Ontarians, or Canadians. And so, therefore, it is that re-examination that makes us a great nation. But we have seen here, Mr. Speaker, the denial in one of the highest form of democracy, the legislation, the denial of proper debate in which some of the issues that touches many of us heart, many of our concern. And that is one of the frustration itself in democracy. And we hope that in the next Parliament, today being the last day, Mr. Speaker, that when we form the next Parliament, regardless of what party it is, that expressive worth is given to people of the parliamentarians to talk about some of those violations and rights. It is very frustrating, especially for myself, Mr. Speaker, who lives with some sort of discrimination faced each day. We in this Parliament are vigilant, I know, in some respect, in seeing that equity is being appreciated. But somehow, when we look at the kind of bureaucratic structure we have in our province, a tremendous amount of frustration, especially in the public service, that have been expressing to me daily, that employment equity in the public service is not working. And I would appeal to the government, the minister, and the opposition to be more vigilant in the sense that equity is being addressed in that region. As I mentioned earlier on, that cases in the Human Rights Commission is backlogged, not for the competence of the Human Rights Commission themselves, but for the resources that are given to that commission. And we have to have that political will to see that it can work, because it is not working. In the courts, Mr. Speaker, there continue to be backlogged people waiting for justice. Their rights are being denied because justice delayed, denied is justice delayed. So I say to you, Mr. Speaker, and to my colleagues, that Human Rights Day, as though we mark another day, that to say it's 45 years, and we look around the world, if we do discriminate here, and without recognizing the international world in the sense of Bosnia, in the sense of Somalia, in South Africa, and all over the world where we see the human rights violation, in China. As a matter of fact, as we see that we're going to start to get the balance whether economic rights or economic situation is much more important than human rights. We have to balance that. Of course, we see a trend of many of us going to China, and yet human rights violations do exist there. In Mexico, it continues to have a high rate of human rights violation. In Haiti, we continue to have that, and all over the world. So I say to us, as we deal with situations in a domestic form or local form, we have an impact internationally. So again, we look forward to another year where we are just as vigilant in addressing the violation of human rights here and abroad. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Leader of the Third Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, too, would like to join with other members of the Legislature today in acknowledging the 46th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights adopted in 1948 by the United Nations. On behalf of my party, I would like to say, too, how deeply proud I am of our record, our collective record of achievement in this province on the issue of human rights. Ontario, under the leadership of Premier John Robarts, was the first jurisdiction in Canada to adopt a human rights code that was modeled on the United Nations Declaration, and that was over 32 years ago. Our party established the Human Rights Commission, and through the Ministry of Citizenship opened our doors to thousands of new Canadians through the Ontario Welcome House program. Our record of human rights and economic opportunity made Ontario an exceptional place to live, work, and raise a family. Millions of new Canadians chose our province over any other place on earth to call home. So no individual, no party, nor province has a monopoly on compassion. No individual or party or province holds a monopoly on support for the principles of human rights. We in this chamber all believe in democracy and in the right to self-determination. We all support the protection of individuals' right to safety of persons. In his most famous speech, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. said that he had a dream that one day people would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. We all agree that every individual should be treated equally in the eyes of the law, in the job market, in the housing market, indeed in all of society, regardless of race, of religion, of gender, of ethnic origin. However, we can and we must strive to do better, to continue to move forward. And in that regard, I do want to address a few comments to all of us on the threat of political correctness as it relates to this issue of human rights. As I said, Mr. Speaker, we all agree in this chamber on the importance of human rights. However, we do disagree, as is our right in a democratic and pluralistic society, on how best to protect, to preserve, and to enhance those rights and freedoms. I know the Premier believes in equality of outcome. I believe in equality of opportunity. The Premier and his caucus believe that laws should be passed to establish hiring quotas. The government may try to pass the system off as voluntary, talk about goals and timetables. Nevertheless, when you are legally required to hire by race, color, sex, or other physical characteristics, that is a quota. I, on the other hand, agree with the words of Martin Luther King. Everyone should be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. No one should be denied an opportunity because of their color, ethnic origin, religious beliefs, or gender. That must include the young white male son of Estonian immigrants as much as the daughter of a third-generation Chinese or first-generation Somali. Each of these individuals should be hired on merit. They must be guaranteed an equal opportunity to compete based on merit. Support, then, for equality of opportunity is hollow rhetoric unless you support efforts to enhance those opportunities. That means equal access to education, equal access to jobs, equal access to promotion opportunities, and equal treatment under the law. It means no glass ceilings for women, no denial of access because of religious headgear. It means no quotas. Opportunity, like justice, should be blind. The point I am making, Mr. Speaker, is that political correctness and the issue of human rights can sometimes lead to reverse discrimination. This new discrimination in and of itself creates new tensions and new frustrations in our multicultural society. Mr. Speaker, while we are acknowledging the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights and Human Rights Day, I also want to touch on our own record, on the necessity of consistency and maintaining consistency as a signal to the rest of the world. For Ontario, Canada is, in fact, held up to the rest of the world. We've all listened to speeches in this chamber from politicians of every party on the issue of human rights. As leader of my party over the past 4 years, I'm sure I have made mistakes, but I've tried to be consistent. Consistent from year to year. Consistent in rural Ontario and in urban Ontario. And most importantly, Mr. Speaker, consistent in what I advocate in opposition and what I would do in government. As we talk about human rights today, we can recall the emotions and feelings of 1989, when all of us in Canada were gripped by the scene of a lone student just outside Tiananmen Square staring down the barrel of an army tank in China. We all thought about the human rights of the students in the square and the millions of Chinese citizens that they symbolized. We watched to see what would happen after those tanks started to roll. 5 years later, I see pictures of Bob Rae and Bob Nixon signing an agreement with the same Chinese government to purchase nuclear reactors from Canada. Mr. Speaker, I don't oppose trade with China, but I find it disappointing to see politicians who gave eloquent political speeches about human rights in opposition now selling nuclear reactors to the same government that was on the other end of that tank gun in 1989. And not one word went out to the rest of the world that watches Ontario, not one word on human rights. Mr. Speaker, I thought it was very important to touch on these issues as an illustration of how much we can still do, of how absolutely important it is for Ontario, watched by the rest of the world, to be consistent, It is important we all acknowledge and celebrate Human Rights Day and the advances we have made as a province since the end of the Second World War in the issue of human rights. There is much more that can be done for individuals, though, in Ontario and around the world. I believe the best way to advance human rights and dignity, both at home and abroad, is to provide an example that is consistent, credible, believable, and to provide greater opportunities. That opportunity doesn't come from words or politically correct phrases or interjections. It comes from education, protection under the law, and economic advancement. One of the best ways we can enhance opportunity in Ontario is to provide a strong economy, a fair justice system, an accessible health care system, excellence in education, equal and accessible to all. we can focus on those priorities and bring common sense to government, we will continue to build and enhance individual opportunity, economic growth, and human rights in Ontario. That's my goal, Mr. Speaker. I believe, regardless of our philosophical approach, it is the goal of every member of the House. We may differ on how to achieve the goal, but the continued commitment by all of us in this chamber to a better and to a fairer society must be resolute. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
It is now time for a point of order. The member for St. Catharines.
Perhaps you could help me with this, Mr. Speaker. This is an anniversary, one-year anniversary, and I was wondering if you have been able to determine whether the investigation has been concluded by the OPP into Jim Coyle and Richard Brennan, two members of the press gallery, who last year brought this to your attention. It's 1 year later. It's their anniversary. I wonder if you had determined whether they were innocent or guilty or what had happened. No?
Is mistaken. I have not had any connection with the Ontario Provincial Police regarding an investigation which the member speaks of. Point of privilege, the member for York East.
Privilege, Mr. Speaker. I was very disturbed by the comments by the leader of the third party when he said that justice should be blind. I think blind people would find that offensive. But what's more, he failed to mention people with disabilities. He didn't say one word about people with disabilities, and I guess that shows how the common sense revolution works. And I don't accept the language that he used. I feel it's offensive to the disabled community.
To the honourable member for York East, I appreciate the concerns which he brings to my attention. However, he does not have a point of privilege. There certainly are often differences of opinion which are expressed in this chamber. It is now time for oral questions. Point of order, the member for Halton Centre.
For unanimous consent of the House to revert to ministerial statements to allow the Minister of Health to address nurse practitioners, the hospital reallocation formula, details of the catastrophic drug program.
Is there unanimous consent to revert to ministerial statements? I heard at least one negative voice. It is now time for oral questions, and the honourable member for Renfrew North.
Much, Mr. Speaker.
I'm just asking for your guidance on when I'd like the leader of the third party to withdraw his statement when he said justice should be blind. It's the same type of a statement as saying falling on deaf ears. So I'd like him to withdraw the unparliamentary language.
As I stated earlier to the member, he does not have a point of privilege. However, as is the custom in the chamber, if something is found to be offensive to another member, the first member has the opportunity to so withdraw the remark if he or she chooses to do so, and I now allow that opportunity to the honourable leader of the third party.
Speaker, I appreciate your ruling that it was not unparliamentary. If it offends anybody, though, I certainly withdraw it.
And perhaps it is now